A poem in your pocket. This is a title I came upon when I was working in a school library. So it's from a child's poem. And I really liked the little poem, very short. And I'll read it first. And then there's a couple things I wanted to say about it. So basically, I'm going to be talking about different poems that, you know, affected me in some way, or I still have stuck in my head. At one time, but not anymore, I had most of these memorized, but you know, it slips away sometimes. Okay, it's called Keep a Poem in Your Pocket, and it's a good advice. Notice I got this from my pocket, okay. Keep a poem in your pocket. Keep a poem in your pocket and a picture in your head, and you'll never be lonely at night when you're in bed. The little poem will sing to you, the little picture bring to you a dozen dreams to dance to you at night when you're in bed. So keep a picture in your pocket and a poem in your head, and you'll never feel lonely at night when you're in bed. And the person who wrote it is Beatrice Schenk de Rigners. I really can't say her name, but that's it. And well, it made me think of a couple things. First, I remember reading about some political prisoner who was hidden away in the basement of some castle. And, you know, he was alone, he saw no one, but he had a lot of resources of his own, things that he had memorized or read that came back to him. Whereas some people don't have too many resources like that. So I thought, well, that's a good thing. That's a good thing, I think. And then another, for a while I was doing this. I can't remember what brought it on, but it might have been a book I read. But I would write down some little inspirational saying, and it might have been a poem, and I'd put it in my pocket. And then during the day, every now and then, probably when I was working at school, I'd pull it out and I'd just look at it and it would remind me, like there's other ways of acting and being and etc. So I thought, well, that poem reminded me of both those things. Until recently, I never read any poetry books. I still don't read them very much. Any poetry books or checked them out from the library or bought any of this kind of stuff. Maybe I heard about poems though, like from school when I was a kid and later, or maybe like, you know, looking for poems for the kids, or somebody sent me a poem or something like that. But it had to come to me some way, right? So these first two that I'm going to hopefully half read, half recite to you were ones from school when I was, you know, junior high or high school. I don't exactly know. And I thought I'd start with a Robert Frost poem that many of you probably had to memorize too. We had to each memorize it, come in front of the class and recite it. But then I was pretty young then, so don't expect too much. Okay. Okay. Who's stopping by woods on a snowy evening? Robert Frost, right? You may just do it in your head. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not mind me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. So one of the things that came to me about this poem, and it might have happened to you too if you had to memorize it, there were certain parts of this poem that other kids could change and come up with some slightly different words. So I just would like to mention one here. When we're talking about the horse's harness bells, it says he gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. But in my reading of it, or my cohort's reading of it, it was, he gives his harness bells a shake. Oh, I think I did the wrong one. I'm sorry. Oh, well, it was my little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a keg of beer. So that was important. Anyway, the other thing I wanted to mention is, I had this poem in my head for many years. Can you imagine junior high or high school till now? And we went through a period where we would get to go to winter solstice events. And after a while, I realized that this poem might have happened on the night of the winter solstice, which I thought was somewhat significant because it says, to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. So I thought, oh, well, that's kind of cool. See, it may or may not have been true, but it's okay. Okay, going on, this other poem I'm pretty sure this was junior high. It's part of a larger poem called The New Colossus, but I didn't know that. And it's written by Emma Lazarus, and she wrote it for some event where they were trying to earn money for the foundation of the Statue of Liberty. And it's in the Statue of Liberty too. So it may be familiar for another reason to you too. So I'm just reading the last kind of section. It says, it's what the Statue of Liberty is saying, I guess. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. So if you had to memorize that like I did, you possibly also remember hearing it a number of times while our last president was president, because people would recite it. Basically, they didn't think that person had the same immigration policy as the Statue of Liberty. And I think they had a good point. Yes, anyway, so that. And we know anyway that, well, he certainly didn't memorize this poem. Well, I guess I can't say any more than that. I won't say any more about that. Okay, going on, so that I thought it was it's the clever use of words, even though it might not be all so politically correct, but still. In college, we studied quite a few English poets, but I didn't memorize any of the poems except one, and we weren't required, by the way, to memorize this, and it was, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. Some of you probably have heard this one by William Wordsworth. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er hill and dale, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. The waves beside them danced with glee. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such a jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show had brought. For oft, when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon the inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. So I particularly like the vision of the daffodils at the beginning, right? And then the verse at the end, it's sort of like, oh, it meant so much to this person way long after he'd seen them. Yeah. Then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. So that one is definitely a favorite of mine too. So when we had kids, well, we read them a lot of Robert Louis Stevenson poems, Child's Garden of Verses. And this is another book of poems, when we were very young by A.A. Milne. Somebody gave it to us, I guess. I don't know where it came from. But there was one in here that I found particularly appealing, and other people seem to too. And the one I've got marked is another one. Oh, well, you might get to hear them all till I get to the right one. Let's see. Sorry, guys. It's called Disobedience. Disobedience, and it wasn't the kid that was being disobedient. No, it was the mother, because she should be obedient to her child. Well, maybe I won't get to read it. I can't find, isn't that it? I had it marked, blah, 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 blah. Okay, sorry, guys. Somehow you have to hear it. I could start it, but then I get to this point where I couldn't say it anymore. Well, here it is. It's even marked with a little circle around it. Okay. Oh, well, sorry. Okay, so it's called Disobedience. Here we go. This is like a story, but it also kind of bounces along. So I think that, kids and adults like the bouncing, right? James Morrison, Weatherby George Dupree, took great care of his mother, though he was only 3. James said to his mother, "Mother," he said he, "you must never go down to the end of town if you don't go down with me." James Morrison's mother put on a golden gown. James Morrison's mother drove to the end of town. James Morrison's mother said to herself, said she, "I can get right back down to the end of town and be back in time for tea." King John put up a notice, "Lost or stolen or strayed. James Morrison's mother seems to have been mislaid. Last seen wandering vaguely, quite of her own accord, she tried to get down to the end of town. 40 shillings reward." James Morrison, commonly known as Jim, told his other relations not to go blaming him. James said to his mother, "Mother," he said he, "you must never go down to the end of town without consulting me." James Morrison's mother hasn't been heard of since. King John said he was sorry, so did the Queen and Prince. King John, somebody told me, said to a man he knew, "If people go down to the end of the town, well, what can anyone do?" James Morrison, Weatherby George Dupree, took great care of his mother, though he was only 3. James said to his mother, "Mother," he said he, "you must never go down to the end of the town if you don't go down with me." So you can see why adults kind of liked it, but kids liked it too, and it does have that little feel, like little bouncy. James, okay. And then, like I mentioned, I did read poems to kids at Farrell on View, where I worked. And of course, the poems Langston Hughes wrote, well, he did write some things for kids, but the one that I'm reading, this one is not one he wrote for kids, I don't think. It's called Mother to Son, and it's a mother talking to her son. Okay, Mother to Son by Langston Hughes. "Well, son, I'll tell you, life for me ain't been no crystal stair. It's had tacks in it, and splinters, and boards torn up, and places with no carpet on the floor, bare. But all the time I's been a climbing on, and reaching landings, and turning corners, and sometimes going in the dark where there ain't been no light. So, boy, don't you turn back. Don't you set down on the steps 'cause you finds it kind of hard. Don't you fall now, for I's still going, honey. I's still climbing, and life for me ain't been no crystal stair." But I like that comparison of life to a stairway, and it ain't been no crystal stair. Okay, so although it wasn't written for kids, they did understand it. So sometimes I just found a poem I particularly like. Somebody sent me the words, or I'd find it somewhere. And some of them I would memorize and use for my meditation practice, for what Eknath Eschwaran called passage meditation, where you slowly say a passage, an inspiring passage. And that's what this next one is. I certainly have it memorized, but I think I better look at it, because I don't seem to be doing that well with my memory. Okay, this is by Saint Teresa of Avila. Her heart is full of joy with love, for in the holy her mind is stilled. She has renounced every selfish attachment and draws abiding joy and strength from the one within. She lives not for herself, but lives to serve the Lord of love in all. She swims across the sea of life, breasting its rough waves joyfully. Another one I read. I thanked Al-Hassi for this, because when we were sheltering in place, we would have meditation on Zoom, and we get together, after we actually meditated and maybe ate, sometimes reading at the same time. And instead of reading a book and talking about it, he had a, he had a podcast. I'm ahead of myself. If I just didn't look at it, that would be better, huh? Well, never mind. He had a podcast. And it was Sam Harris. And in this case, he was talking to David Whyte, the poet David Whyte. And I had heard of David Whyte and maybe seen a poem or two, but I really didn't know much about him at all. And so I took, as did some other people in the group, to David Whyte, some of his poems, and it was hard actually to memorize this one, because really I didn't, and maybe I still don't understand it all. But the very first part, at least, I think I got the idea. So I slowly memorized it, and it has not so slowly slipped out of my mind since then, and that was just recently. Okay, and it is called the same thing as this book, The Bell and the Blackbird by David Whyte. The sound of a bell still reverberating, or a blackbird calling from a corner of the field, asking you to wake into this life, or inviting you deeper to one that waits. Either way takes courage. Either way wants you to be nothing but that self that is no self at all. Wants you to walk to the place where you find you already know how to give every last thing away. The approach that is also the meeting itself, without any meeting at all. That radiance you have always carried with you as you walk, both alone and completely accompanied in friendship by every corner of the world, crying, Alleluia. Another poem that I use sometimes in meditation was what we had for the call to worship, the Rumi poem. I use that quite a bit. That was sent to me by a friend. And I thought it was probably significant that in that Rumi poem, 3 times after each verse, it says, don't go back to sleep. So I figured that must be a pretty important part. It took me a while to figure that out. Of the poem, it's sort of like, pay attention, don't go back to sleep. The breeze at dawn has secrets to tell you. Don't go back to sleep. That's the first one. Okay. The last poem that I'm going to mention is one you've already heard too, because Marguerite read it. It's super short, so I shouldn't need this paper at all. It's one of Emily Dickinson's, right? And I found it just about the time when my Aunt Elsie, who was my favorite aunt, died, and it seemed so appropriate. In this short life that lasts only an hour, how much, how little is within our power. So, remember, keep a poem in your pocket and a picture in your head, and you'll never be lonely at night when you're in bed. Okay, now it's your turn. Thank goodness.